The aeroplane touched the runway shortly after midday. Tawanda looked through the window. For the first time in 25 years, the ground beneath him was Zimbabwe. He had imagined this moment many times. In some versions, the return was dramatic. The aircraft door opened, warm air entered, his feet touched the country, and something inside him shifted. Home recognized him. But the real moment was quieter. There was the hard sound of tires meeting the runway, the engines slowing, passengers reaching for their phones, seatbelts opening before the aircraft had completely stopped, and a child asking whether they had arrived. Then came ordinary movement. Tawanda remained seated for a few seconds. He looked through the window at the airport buildings. They were not the buildings he remembered. The terminal was larger, brighter, and more polished. Glass, metal, open space, clean lines and new passenger bridges stood where his memory expected an older and smaller airport. He had returned looking for evidence of a country that had declined. The country's first answer was a new airport. That unsettled the story he had prepared. This episode follows Tawanda from that airport to Mbizo 4 in Kwekwe, not only to see what changed, but to understand what 25 years of absence does to a person's idea of home. By the end, you will understand why a returnee can see collapse where the person who stayed sees adaptation, why genuine improvements can exist inside a broader national decline, and why visiting the place that raised you is not automatically the same thing as coming home. This is the Kopje Journal and Review. If you are new here and value serious cultural and forensic analysis on Zimbabwe, South Africa, and the wider African region, subscribe and turn on notifications. The real question is simple. What happens when you return to the neighborhood that raised you, but the life you expected to find there no longer exists? Tawanda stood when the passengers in front of him began moving. He reached for his bag. The airline that had brought him home was not Air Zimbabwe. He noticed that he had expected to notice. Air Zimbabwe had not completely disappeared. Its name remained, its colors remained, selected flights still operated, and recovery plans continued to be announced, but the airline was no longer the dependable national bridge Tawanda remembered. When he was young, Air Zimbabwe had represented more than transport. It had represented national arrival. There was the bird on the tail, the Zimbabwean crew, the newspapers in the seat pocket, and the small certainty that the country could carry its own people into the world and bring them back again. Now, he had returned through another carrier. It was not a personal tragedy. The aeroplane had landed safely, the service had worked, but the absence entered his mind before he had even passed through immigration. A country can remain connected to the world after its national airline weakens. Foreign airlines will carry the passengers. Connections will be made through other capitals. The airport will remain active, but something changes when the country stops reliably carrying its own name through the sky. Tawanda walked into the terminal. He slowed down. The building was genuinely impressive. There was no reason to lie about that. The ceiling rose high above the passengers, the lighting was clean, the immigration area was larger than the one preserved inside his memory. The movement of people felt orderly. The new terminal did what an airport was supposed to do. It gave the arriving traveller a strong first impression. For a moment, Tawanda felt proud. Then another thought entered. He knew the airport expansion had been financed through a loan of approximately 153 million United States dollars from the China Export-Import Bank. He remembered the photograph of construction, the official ceremonies and the promises about passenger capacity, investment and tourism. He also remembered the arguments that had followed Chinese-financed infrastructure across Zimbabwe. Who had negotiated the loan? Who carried the repayment obligation? How much of the construction had built domestic capacity? What had been borrowed, what had been gained, and what would still be working 20 years later? Tawanda also remembered public reporting about money, allegedly moved from an airport project account during a period of severe foreign currency pressure. Government officials had disputed parts of that account. Tawanda had not arrived carrying an auditor's file. He did not know every document, every transaction, or every explanation, but he knew the national feeling. A new public structure could inspire pride and suspicion. A road could be opened, and people would ask how much had disappeared. A hospital could be built, and people would ask whether the equipment would work. A power station could be expanded, and people would ask who had received the contract. Progress no longer arrived alone. It arrived with another question attached. Who will pay for it? The airport was real progress. The debt was also real. The beauty of the terminal did not cancel the financing question. The financing question did not cancel the beauty of the terminal. Tawanda held both thoughts together. That would become the discipline of the entire return. He would have to resist two easy stories. The first story said everything had collapsed. The second said every new structure proved the country was recovering. Neither was sufficient. The airport was the first warning. Zimbabwe had not stood still waiting for his judgment. The country had changed in contradictory ways. Immigration moved quickly. His passport was stamped. His suitcase appeared without difficulty. He passed through customs and entered the arrivals area. For several seconds, he could not see Jonathan. Drivers held printed names, families stood behind the barrier, people lifted phones, children moved between adults, taxi drivers studied the faces of arriving passengers. Then Tawanda heard his name, not the careful version, used by colleagues and officials, the old version. The name stretched by someone who had once shouted it across childhood yards. Tawanda! Jonathan was waving with both hands. He looked older than the brother preserved in Tawanda's memory. Of course he did. But memory had not prepared Tawanda for the change. Jonathan's hair had thinned. Grey had entered his beard. His shoulders had become heavier. His face still carried the same quick smile. The brothers embraced. Jonathan laughed first. You have become an old man. You are older than me. Yes, but I stayed here. Zimbabwe preserves us. Jonathan laughed at his own joke. Tawanda laughed too. The embrace lasted slightly longer than either man expected. Then they stepped apart and looked at each other properly. Each was searching for the younger brother, still visible inside the older face. Jonathan took one side of the suitcase. Tawanda tried to take it back. You are coming home, Jonathan said. Let us at least carry your bag. Outside, the light was hard and familiar. Tawanda stopped near the entrance and looked back. At the terminal, Jonathan followed his eyes. Beautiful, isn't it? It is. You did not expect this? Tawanda smiled. Jonathan had already begun speaking on behalf of the country. Not officially, not politically, instinctively. He had lived through every year Tawanda had been away. He had defended the place, in private arguments, complained about it, adapted to it, built inside it, buried people inside it, and raised children inside it. He did not want his brother's first act to be a verdict. "Things have changed," Jonathan said. "You will see." Tawanda placed his suitcase in the vehicle. He had imagined returning to Kwekwe by train. That had been part of the private plan, not because the train would be faster. It would not. Not because it would necessarily be more comfortable. It might not. He wanted the railway because the railway belonged to the Zimbabwe he had carried away. The national railways of Zimbabwe had once tied the country together in his mind through Harare, Kwekwe, Gweru, and Bulawayo. He remembered the stations, the whistles, the steel tracks, the heavy coaches, the slow authority of a train arriving, the platform conversations, the luggage and the food carried for the journey. He remembered the sense that the country had a timetable. As a boy, Tawanda had loved trains. The railway line represented distance without separation. A person could leave one city at night and arrive in another in the morning. The train passed through darkness, farms, sidings, and small settlements. You slept inside. The movement of the country. When he told Jonathan that he had considered using the train, his brother looked at him and laughed. Which train? The question was light, the answer was not. There was no ordinary Harare to Kwekwe passenger service waiting for him. The passenger railway he remembered no longer functioned as a dependable national system. There had been announcements about restoring selected services. Some tourism and intercity operations had appeared in limited form, but the railway was not available to carry. To wander from the airport into the return he had imagined. The tracks remained, the stations remained, the institution remained. But the practical relationship between the railway and the ordinary passenger had largely disappeared. Tawanda had arrived on a foreign airline. Now he would travel to Kwekwe by road because the national passenger train was not there. Before leaving the airport, two institutions from his remembered Zimbabwe had already become absences, the national airline and the passenger railway. They had not vanished completely. That almost made the loss harder to explain. Ruins are easy to understand. A name that remains after its everyday function has weakened is more complicated. Jonathan started the vehicle. "Do not worry," he said. "By road, we will be home before evening." Home, the word landed quickly. Tawanda looked through the window as they left the airport. Jonathan drove, Jonathan talked. He pointed to developments, with the enthusiasm of a person showing a guest that the household had not collapsed while he was away. There were new buildings, new walls, more vehicles, new fuel stations and advertisements for data, banking, funeral policies, schools, churches, building materials and solar equipment. Zimbabwe had become visually busier. Phones connected people who had once waited weeks for letters. Money moved through applications and electronic services. Person could communicate with family across several countries before leaving the airport car park. New homes had appeared around the edges of the city. Some were large, some were unfinished, some stood behind high walls. Tawanda watched the walls pass. He did not say what he was thinking. The houses were larger. The public spaces between them often looked less cared for. Private improvement had advanced faster than common infrastructure. The household had learned to build around the state. A family installed solar because the electricity system could not always be trusted. It installed a water tank because the tap could not always be trusted. It drilled a borehole if it had the money, raised the wall because security could not be assumed, and bought a vehicle because public transport could be exhausting. It paid for private education if the local school no longer inspired confidence. It paid for private medical care when it could. Each private solution improved the life of the household that could afford it. Together, those solutions also revealed the weakening of the shared system. Tawanda saw progress, but it was often fenced progress. Jonathan drove toward Harare. The traffic thickened. Commuter omnibuses moved between lanes. Conductors leaned from doors and called destinations. Passengers waited in groups. A bus stopped where Tawanda did not expect a bus stop, while another pulled away before its door had fully closed. Small vehicles competed with larger ones. Vendors approached, slowing traffic. One person carried mobile phone accessories, another held fruit, and someone else offered bottled water. The city moved through negotiation. Jonathan navigated without complaint. He knew which lane would close, which vehicle would force its way in, where a combi would stop, and where a pedestrian might suddenly cross. Tawanda watched the combis carefully. They pulled him toward Mbizo before the journey had reached Kwekwe. He remembered the commuter omnibuses of his youth. The queues in the morning, the conductor calling for town, coins moving from hand to hand, school children pressing between adults and a mother carrying shopping while controlling two children with one look. He remembered workers calculating weather. They were already late, music playing from a tired speaker, the smell of fuel, dust and warm clothing. Arguments about change and arguments about where the passenger had asked to stop. Someone always believed one more person could fit. The combi had never been elegant. When Tawanda left, he had complained about it. He had complained about the waiting, the crowding, the condition of some vehicles, the behavior of some conductors, and the lack of order. In his memory, those problems had remained at the level of youthful irritation. Now he saw a transport system carrying even more pressure. The city had grown, formal employment had weakened. More people survived through movement, vending, small trade, and temporary work. The combi was not merely a bus, it was a compressed room containing the economy. The driver needed enough passengers to make the trip worthwhile. The conductor needed speed. The passenger needed affordability. The police wanted compliance. The vehicle owner wanted a return. The road had limited space, and the city had limited alternatives. Everyone's pressure entered the same minibus. Tawanda could see newer vehicles among the old ones. Some combis were cleaner than those he remembered. Phones had changed how drivers and passengers communicated. Families could call and ask where the vehicle had reached. Digital maps existed, and roadside businesses were more connected, but the deeper transport experience remained familiar. The passenger adjusted to the system rarely adjusted to the passenger. Jonathan sounded the horn. A combi moved across them. "You see, these people," he said, "they think they own the road." He did not sound angry, he sounded experienced. They passed accumulated rubbish near a busy area. Plastic bags had caught against grass and drainage edges. Some waste had been burnt, leaving a dark patch behind. Tawanda looked at it until the vehicle moved beyond it. When he left Zimbabwe, water interruptions and streetlights that did not work. He had carried those failures with him as evidence of why leaving made sense, but the return presented a difficult possibility. Some of the things he had considered unacceptable in 2000, and one had become worse, not everywhere, not on every road, not in every neighborhood, but enough to disturb him. A decline does not always arrive as one dramatic event. Sometimes it is an uncollected pile that remains long enough to become part of the corner, a pothole repaired badly and then reopened, a public toilet closed, a light that stops working and is never discussed again, a council vehicle that breaks down, a pipe that leaks, or a service reduced from regular to occasional. A problem initially treated as temporary becomes the new description of ordinary life. Tawanda had expected the Zimbabwe of 25 years later to contain new problems. He had not expected so. Many old problems to remain older, larger, and more deeply accepted. Jonathan continued speaking. "You should see the new shops," Tawanda nodded. "You will not recognize Kwekwe." Tawanda looked at his brother. Jonathan was excited. That excitement was not ignorance. Jonathan knew the potholes, the refuse, the water schedule, the electricity costs and the services that had declined. But he also knew what had been built in spite of them. For Jonathan, a new supermarket was not propaganda. It was a real shop where people bought real goods. A renovated house was not merely diaspora display. It was a family improving its position. Solar system was not only evidence of electricity failure, it also meant that children could study at night. A water tank was not only evidence of municipal decline, it meant the household could continue when the taps were dry. Jonathan's pride came from survival that had acquired physical form. He wanted Tawanda to see what people had managed to do. Tawanda was still counting what the country should have done for them. That was the difference between the two brothers. One had lived inside the adaptation. The other was arriving with the memory of the promise. They joined the highway west. Harare began to loosen. The journey toward Kwekwe passed through Norton, Chegutu, Kadoma, and the long Midlands corridor. The road carried buses, trucks, private vehicles, commuter traffic and people moving goods between towns. At the service stations, the Zimbabwe Tawanda remembered met the Zimbabwe built after he left. There were familiar foods, new payment systems, imported drinks, phone chargers, solar products, building advertisements, drivers checking messages and children stepping out of vehicles wearing clothes from several countries. The road was more commercially active than the road inside his memory. There were more vehicles, more roadside trade, more private construction, and more evidence that Zimbabweans had remained economically inventive. The country had not become inactive, it had become intensely active in ways that did not always produce collective progress. People bought, sold, transported, imported, repaired, converted rooms into shops, built cottages behind houses, started schools, opened churches, ran food businesses, sent money, and received money. They moved between Zimbabwe and South Africa, between formal and informal work, and between currencies. Later, he pointed toward new housing. That area has grown. Then came a shopping complex that is also new. Tawanda acknowledged each one. He did not want to become the returnee who dismissed everything before entering the neighborhood. He knew that type of returnee, the person who compared every road, shop, hospital, queue, salary, car, and conversation with another country. The returnee who arrived carrying standards but no patience, the person who treated those who had remained as witnesses in a case already decided. Tawanda did not want to do that, but he also did not want gratitude for isolated improvements to become an instruction not to see the wider decline. The road itself carried both stories. Some sections allowed smooth movement, others demanded attention. Heavy vehicles pressed into the surface. Repairs appeared and disappeared. At intervals, the railway line came close enough to enter Tawanda's view. The tracks followed part of the national corridor, like an old thought. He imagined passenger coaches moving beside them, families at the windows, station platforms, and a railway employee lifting a signal. But no train came. Jonathan noticed him looking. You really wanted that train? Yes. You always liked trains. They made the country feel connected. We are connected. Jonathan lifted his phone. More than before, Tawanda smiled. Jonathan was right. He was also wrong. The phone connected voices. The railway connected places through a public system. One was not a substitute for the other. A video call could connect a family in 4 countries. It could not move a worker cheaply from Harare to Kwekwe, carry bulk freight away from the road, or restore the station as a center of civic movement. It could not recreate the sense that national infrastructure belonged to ordinary people. The railway's decline was not only sentimental to Tawanda, it was structural. When passenger rail disappears, the person without a private vehicle loses an option, the road carries more pressure, the bus becomes more important, the fare becomes more powerful, distance becomes more expensive, but the emotional loss came first. The country of his childhood had made a sound, metal against rail and a whistle at night. That sound had faded. Near Norton, Jonathan asked whether he wanted something to eat. Tawanda said he could wait. Jonathan stopped anyway. "You have been travelling. Eat." They bought food and stood beside the vehicle. The sun had begun moving west. Jonathan answered calls. Someone in Kwekwe wanted to know where they had reached. Another relative asked whether supper should be prepared immediately. A nephew sent a message. The family was tracking the return in real time. 25 years earlier, an arrival could remain uncertain until the person appeared. Now every stage carried a timestamp. The distance between Tawanda and Mbizo was shrinking on several phones. Landed, cleared immigration, left the airport, passed Norton, approaching Chegutu, and near Kadoma. Jonathan looked at his brother. "Are you ready?" "For what?" "To see everyone." Tawanda was not sure. He had imagined the place more often than he had imagined the people. The houses had remained still in his mind, the people had not. People aged, moved, separated, married, died, became ill, prospered, struggled, became difficult, or became strangers. The return to a building was simple. The return to relationships required an accounting. Who had called whom? Who had helped whom? Who had disappeared during a funeral? Who had sent money? Who believed Tawanda had forgotten them? Who expected something and who only wanted to see him? Absence accumulates its own history. The returnee may come home carrying love. The family may receive him carrying 25 years of unanswered questions. They continued west. Chegutu arrived and passed. Then Kadoma. Each town offered Jonathan another opportunity to explain the country. He pointed to new businesses, changed intersections, fuel stations, road repairs, properties and people they had once known. He explained who had left, who had died, who was doing well, who had returned and failed to settle, and who had built a house but still lived abroad. The conversation became a national map made from people. In Zimbabwe, geography and migration had become inseparable. A house in Kwekwe might depend on work. In Johannesburg, school fees in Mbizo might be paid from the United Kingdom. A funeral contribution might arrive from Canada. Building materials might come through Botswana. Groceries might travel from South Africa. A child might be raised by grandparents while the parents worked elsewhere. The neighborhood remained physically in Zimbabwe. Part of its economy lived outside the country. Tawanda had been one strand inside that system. He had thought of himself as someone who left. From Mbizo's perspective, he had also become infrastructure. A caller, a sender, a person asked for help, and a person whose visit was discussed before it occurred. The landscape became more familiar as they entered the Midlands. Tawanda began recognizing the shape of things before he could name them. The light, the color of the soil, the industrial edges, and the approach to Kwekwe entered him before his mind completed the recognition. He sat forward. Jonathan noticed. "Now you know where you are." Tawanda did Kwekwe had once been the entire operational world of his youth. There was the town centre, Mbizo, Amaveni, the industrial areas, and the roads connecting school, work, shops, church, sport, and family. The city had carried mining, industry, railway movement, retail, and township life. It had seemed permanent. A child often mistakes the operating world of childhood for a natural fact. The factory exists because factories exist. The train runs because trains run. The council collect. Refuse because that is what councils do. Water comes from the tap because that is where water comes from. Streetlights come on because evening has arrived. Adults know that every one of those outcomes depends on a functioning institution. Children experience function as nature. Tawanda had left at 25. He had been old enough to see the cracks, but still young enough to believe they would eventually be repaired.
Kufatana nene